The trouble didn't start with a noise complaint or a warning letter. It began with the roar of an entitled teenager's dirt bike ripping across my perfectly rebuilt lawn. Every day, the spoiled son of the HOA president carved deeper wounds into my yard, laughing like he owned the entire neighborhood. His mother, drunk with HOA power, claimed it was just kids having fun. But the day he tore through my newly planted memorial garden, something inside me snapped. That was the moment I decided to set the trap. Before we dive into this battle of arrogance, revenge, and justice, make sure to subscribe, because some HOA nightmares deserve to be exposed, and this one will leave you speechless. The first time I saw the teenager streak across my lawn, kicking up clumps of fresh soil with the spinning back tire of his dirt bike, I told myself to let it go. New neighborhood. New start. Don't make enemies. That was the promise I kept repeating as the rumble faded down the street. But that sound stayed in my head for hours. Vibrations that felt personal, directed, invasive, like someone breathing down the back of my neck. I had spent weeks revitalizing this place, pouring time and savings into transforming a neglected yard into something meaningful. But that boy, Ethan, the HOA president's son, didn't see that. He saw an open field he believed belonged to him. By the third day, the tire tracks carved across the grass like scars. The sun hit them in the early morning, exposing the churned mud and mangled blades of grass, mocking my patience. Every morning I watched as dew collected in those wounds. Every evening I filled them, only for more to appear the next day. People warned me, in hushed tones, not to confront Ethan or his mother, Marlene. She was more than just the HOA president. She was the self-appointed queen of the community. Her word was treated as law. Her son acted like he inherited that throne. And anyone who challenged them ended up with fines, threats, or committee re-evaluations of their home's compliance. But nothing prepared me for the day that shifted everything. The morning had started quietly. Fog clung to the fence line, and the neighborhood felt unusually still. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, admiring the delicate sprigs of green breaking through my reseeded lawn. I had worked late the previous evening to repair the latest damage. My hands still ached, but the sight of new life pushing upward brought a small, peaceful smile to my face. That peace shattered under the violent roar of an engine. I didn't even have time to turn before Ethan's dirt bike shot through the mist like a missile. He hit the center of the lawn, spinning deliberately, the back tire flinging arcs of mud and shredded grass through the air. And then, he rolled right over the small, fenced section of soil I had been nurturing for weeks. A memorial garden. The only place I had ever planted something for my late father. The sound of the tiny wooden border snapping under the bike's weight echoed like breaking bone. My hand loosened. The coffee mug slipped from my grip, shattering against the porch. Steam curled upward from the spreading stain as if the earth itself exhaled in disbelief. Ethan laughed. Actually laughed, as if destroying something sacred was the highlight of his day. It felt like a fuse burned down to its final spark. I stepped forward, but he accelerated toward the street, tearing off without a glance back. The cloud of dust he left behind drifted across the ruins of my garden. That was the last time I tried to reason with this situation. Later that day, after hours of silence and anger twisting painfully inside me, I walked to the HOA office to confront Marlene. The building was small but polished, with brass handles that glinted under the early afternoon sun. The moment I stepped inside, everything smelled sterile, like a place where nothing living was allowed to grow. Marlene sat behind a dark wooden desk, flipping through papers with the rigid precision of someone who believed their power was absolute. Her expression didn't shift when I explained what her son had done. Instead, she leaned back, folded her hands, and delivered a rehearsed speech dripping with false sympathy. "Kids will be kids," she said. "If your lawn can't handle a little activity, perhaps it wasn't up to HOA standards to begin with." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't just defending him, she was blaming me. I asked her to stop him, To enforce the HOA rules she weaponized against everyone else. She smiled, slow, icy, dismissive. "You're new," she said. "You'll learn how things work here." And with that, she returned to her paperwork, dismissing me like a disobedient student. I walked out of that office with my jaw clenched and my pulse pounding. The sun outside felt hotter than before, harsh against my skin. The world looked the same, but something in me had changed. The rules here favored the powerful, not the fair. And I was done playing their game. That night, I stood on my porch, staring at the deep grooves in the soil where my memorial garden had once been. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. The moonlight cast a soft glow across the yard, revealing every wound left by that bike. Something inside me hardened. I didn't want revenge for the sake of ego. I wanted justice, a reckoning, a moment where the entitled and the arrogant found a boundary they could no longer cross. So I planned. Piece by piece, I mapped out the softest section of the yard, the place Ethan always targeted, where he tore through during his chaotic loop. I imagined the path of his bike, the line of his ego, the predictable angle of his descent. And then, with the precision of someone who had been pushed past every reasonable limit, I designed something simple, safe, but guaranteed to shock him into understanding the cost of disrespect. A trap, not to injure him, but to stop him. To expose the lie that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. As the sky darkened and the neighborhood drifted into sleep, I stepped into the yard with tools in hand and a plan burning fiercely inside me. He took everything from my father's memory. Tomorrow I would take back my lawn. And Ethan would never forget what happened next. The night before everything unfolded, the neighborhood was wrapped in a kind of silence that felt both peaceful and heavy, like the calm before a story reaches the moment no one can reverse. Street lights flickered across the pavement, stretching long shadows over the houses, giving the entire block a strange, expectant stillness. Even the air felt different, charged with the weight of something approaching. I stood in my yard under the dim glow of my porch light, holding the tools I had gathered, tracing the exact route Ethan always took when tearing across my lawn. His path was as predictable as the entitled smirk he carried whenever he revved that engine. That predictability became the blueprint for what I built next. The softest part of my lawn rested near the center, where years of water runoff had loosened the soil beneath the surface. To the eye it looked no different than the rest, but anyone stepping on it could feel the faint give beneath their weight, barely noticeable but present. It was the same spot Ethan hit every time he wanted to kick up the highest spray of dirt. I had reseeded it. Too many times to count, always watching it be destroyed within hours. Tonight I would turn that spot into the lesson he refused to learn. I began by cutting carefully through the top layer of grass, lifting it like a blanket and rolling it aside. Beneath it, the soil felt cool and pliable under my hand. Working by the dim light of a headlamp, I shaped a shallow depression, just deep enough for a bike tire to catch, just wide enough to force an abrupt stop, not wide enough to cause real harm. The point wasn't injury, it was revelation. I wanted him to feel, for the first time, what it meant to face resistance. As I shaped the earth, the memory of my father's garden lingered in my mind like a steady throb of pain. That space had been sacred, something meant to honor where I came from. Ethan crushed it without hesitation. Now, for the first time, he would be forced to face the impact of his choices. Once the depression was shaped, I covered it with a thin layer of flexible mesh, strong enough to keep the grass intact but weak enough to collapse under the weight of a speeding bike. Over that, I replaced the cut section of lawn, smoothing it meticulously until it blended into the surrounding earth. Anyone walking across it wouldn't notice a thing. But a dirt bike racing across at full speed? That was a different story. The trap was subtle, invisible, and perfectly aligned with the path Ethan always took. When he hit it, the front tire would sink just enough to jolt him forward and stop the bike cold. The embarrassment alone would be enough to make him think twice next time. By the time I finished, the moon hung high above the rooftops, silver light spilling across the yard, highlighting every curve of soil I had reshaped. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of distant traffic, feeling both nervous and strangely calm. Setting the trap wasn't an act of revenge. It was a boundary he forced me to create. And in this neighborhood, boundaries were the only language people like the HOA president and her son understood. The next morning arrived with an uneasy warmth, the kind that clings to your skin before a storm. The lawn looked perfect, almost deceptively flawless. If someone didn't know what lay beneath the center section, they would never suspect anything. I spent the morning repairing the fences around what used to be my memorial garden. The broken pieces of wood felt splintered and fragile in my hands, reminders of how carelessly Ethan treated things that weren't his. As I worked, neighbors walked by, offering polite nods that carried the familiar undertones of HOA fear. Nobody wanted to get involved in anything that might upset Marlene. Around noon, I heard the distant rumble I had anticipated. The low growl of Ethan's dirt bike vibrated through the pavement, getting louder, more obnoxious, more deliberate. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the certainty of what was about to happen. His engine revved aggressively as he came into view, flying down the street with the carelessness of someone who believed the world belonged to him. I stepped onto my porch, not to stop him, but to witness what he had created. Ethan didn't slow down. He didn't hesitate. He turned sharply into my yard, exactly as he always did, tearing a fresh line into the grass with the confidence of someone who never faced consequences. His body leaned forward, gripping the handlebars as he aimed toward the center, ready to carve another circle of destruction. And then he hit it. The moment was almost cinematic. The front tire dropped abruptly, sinking just a few inches into the depression as the mesh gave way. His bike lurched violently, stopping dead. Ethan's momentum pitched him forward, but not far, just enough to knock him off the seat and send him stumbling onto the ground, landing face-first in the soft soil. The bike fell sideways with a metallic thud. For a heartbeat, the world froze. He didn't scream. He didn't roar. He just lay there, stunned, humiliated, confused, like someone who had finally encountered something stronger than his own entitlement. And then he sat up, wiping mud from his face, breathing in sharp, angry bursts. His eyes darted around the yard until they found me, standing calmly on the porch. For the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, Ethan looked unsure of himself, small, even. He wasn't injured, just shocked. Exactly as intended. But humiliation has a way of turning into something dangerous. Because Ethan didn't run home. He pulled out his phone. And within minutes, Marlene was marching toward my house. Her expression wasn't confused. It was vengeful. And as she stepped onto my walkway, I realized something chilling. She didn't come to talk. She came to retaliate. And the HOA war was only just beginning. Marlene's footsteps cut through the quiet afternoon like the ticking of a countdown, each step sharp, deliberate, fueled by a kind of fury that didn't come from concern for her son, but from the humiliation she believed I had inflicted on her family name. Her presence carried the same cold authority she wielded at every HOA meeting, the kind that made neighbors shrink into their lawns, hoping not to be noticed. As she approached, the sunlight hit the rigid line of her jaw, her expression carved into something both polished and venomous. Ethan followed several feet behind her, still wiping mud from his shirt, his pride injured far more than his body. She stopped at the edge of my lawn, staring at the ground as if expecting to see a landmine. Her gaze traveled slowly across the yard until it reached the subtle patch at the center, the place where Ethan had fallen. Then her eyes lifted, locking onto mine with icy precision. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, stretched taut like a rope pulled between two anchors. I could feel the weight of the neighborhood watching from cracked blinds and slightly lifted curtains. They had seen the boy fall. They knew Marlene's wrath was coming. But nobody came outside. Nobody ever did. When she finally spoke, Her voice was low but vibrating with restrained rage. She accused me of creating a dangerous hazard on my property, one that put her son at risk. The words sounded rehearsed, as if she had prepared them long before arriving. In her version of events, Ethan hadn't been joyriding or destroying my lawn. He had merely passed through, and I had laid a trap meant to injure him. Each sentence she delivered was sharpened by entitlement, built on the assumption that her authority would override any logic or truth. I let her speak. Let her build her accusations. Let her twist the story into something that made her the victim. Because behind every theatrical display, there's always a moment when the performance cracks. And I knew that moment wasn't far. When she finished, I calmly explained the reality she refused to acknowledge. Her son had been trespassing, vandalizing, and violating HOA rules for weeks. I reminded her that I had gone to her office, seeking help, only to be brushed aside with condescending remarks. I told her the trap wasn't meant to harm anyone, it was simply a barrier, a boundary her son had crossed too many times. As I spoke, Ethan's face flushed deeper, the embarrassment spreading like wildfire across his expression. He hated hearing the truth laid bare, especially in front of his mother. But Marlene didn't flinch. She doubled down, insisting that the HOA would take immediate action. A formal investigation, heavy fines, mandatory inspections, safety violations. She listed each threat like a weapon being cocked. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't about safety or concern for her son. It was about dominance, control, retaliation for the one thing she could not tolerate, public humiliation. Then she delivered the final blow. She declared the entire situation an HOA emergency, something that apparently granted her the power to issue temporary restrictions on my property. According to her, I was now required to remove all unapproved ground alterations immediately, and the HOA reserved the right to inspect my yard at any time. She claimed that failure to comply could result in legal action or even forced property modifications. It was intimidation wrapped in official language. But intimidation loses its power when the person being targeted isn't afraid. I told her clearly, without anger, that she had no such authority. She could file reports, submit complaints, consult rulebooks, but she could not fabricate powers just because she felt threatened. I watched a twitch of irritation flash across her face, a small fracture in her composure. Her plan depended on fear, and I wasn't providing any. Before she could respond, a breeze drifted across the lawn, rustling the leaves of the oak tree near the sidewalk. The scene felt almost theatrical, two opposing forces standing on the edge of a conflict that neither could step back from. Finally, Marlene turned sharply, ordering Ethan to follow her. He hesitated, glancing back at the spot where he had fallen, then at me, with a mixture of anger and bewildered resentment. As they walked away, I knew the confrontation was only the beginning. HOA presidents don't lose battles quietly. They escalate them. Within hours, the retaliation began. I received the first notice that evening, a printed envelope taped to my front door. The paper inside listed an assortment of sudden violations, ranging from overgrown grass to improper edging along the garden bed. Every claim was exaggerated or fabricated. The second notice arrived the next morning, citing unapproved landscaping modifications. By noon, a third notice accused me of creating a safety hazard that endangered the community. 3 violations in 24 hours, all coordinated, all manufactured. Neighbors walked past my driveway with guarded expressions. Some looked sympathetic, others fearful, all of them unwilling to intervene. It wasn't their battle. It was mine. That night, as the sun dipped behind the houses, I stepped onto my porch and stared at the stack of notices. Each one represented a card Marlene thought she could play to force me into submission. But every attempt at intimidation only confirmed how deeply my simple trap had shaken her. She needed power like oxygen, and losing control, especially in front of the community, was a wound she refused to expose. I knew the HOA would take more aggressive action soon. Fines weren't enough. Notices weren't enough. People like Marlene didn't stop until they reminded everyone who held the reins. What I didn't expect was how far she would go next. The following morning, I woke to the growl of two unfamiliar trucks idling in front of my house. The sound rumbled through the walls, low and unsettling. I stepped outside and saw the HOA's contracted landscaping crew unloading equipment: saws, trenching tools, heavy machinery. Their uniforms bore the HOA emblem, along with a clipboard held by the supervising foreman. He approached me with calculated neutrality. According to his paperwork, the HOA had authorized a forcible compliance order, which granted them the right to enter my property to remove dangerous or non-compliant features. None of this was legal. None of it followed protocol. But the HOA counted on one thing: that most homeowners didn't know their rights well enough to push back. Unfortunately for Marlene, I wasn't most homeowners. I stepped forward, blocking their path, and told them in clear, unwavering terms that setting foot on my property without permission would constitute trespassing. The foreman hesitated, uncomfortable, glancing between me and the order he'd been handed. He wasn't paid enough to fight legal battles for someone else's vendetta. After a tense pause, he ordered his men to wait while he contacted the HOA office. But the moment he stepped aside to make the call, something across the street caught my attention. A camera. Not just one, 3. All pointed at my house. It wasn't paranoia. It was surveillance. Marlene hadn't just escalated the war. She had turned my home into a battlefield under close watch. And what she planned next would push everything past the breaking point. The cameras appeared overnight like silent sentinels, perched on the corners of houses across the street, their lenses glinting faintly in the early morning light. They weren't discreet. Marlene didn't want discretion. She wanted intimidation. 3 cameras angled precisely toward my lawn, my driveway, my front door. Their red indicator lights blinked in a steady rhythm, as if keeping time with the escalating hostility of the HOA war. Each blink felt like a reminder that I was being watched, evaluated, recorded, not for safety but for ammunition. I stood in my doorway, staring at them as the landscaping crew waited by their trucks, the tension as thick as humidity before a storm. The foreman still clutched his clipboard, pacing in small circles as he tried contacting Marlene. With each passing minute, it became clear that even he didn't want to be part of this dispute. His pauses, his muttered responses, the way he kept glancing at the cameras, all of it painted a picture of a man caught in someone else's crusade. Across the street, blinds shifted. Silhouettes moved behind glass. Neighbors watched passively, aware that conflict had reached a point none of them wanted to acknowledge. In communities controlled by HOAs, silence was often the currency of survival. Speaking up meant consequences. Speaking out meant retaliation. Most preferred to remain invisible. But I no longer had that luxury. After several tense minutes, the foreman returned and announced that the HOA had ordered him to stand down temporarily. The pause in aggression was not a victory, just a recalibration. He informed me they'd be back once the HOA board convened an emergency meeting to determine the appropriate level of corrective action. His tone revealed how little he believed in the legitimacy of those words. He didn't linger. The trucks rumbled to life, the equipment rattled against metal frames, and the crew slowly rolled away from my home. But the cameras didn't leave. Their presence loomed like a threat carved from glass and steel. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my property, noting their angles and coverage. Every step I took was shadowed by their blinking lights. Their installation was invasive, but the intimidation behind them was unmistakable. Marlene had escalated the conflict into psychological warfare. She wanted me uncomfortable, unsettled, reactive. She wanted footage she could twist into violations, evidence she could weaponize, moments she could distort into the narrative she needed. What she didn't realize was that surveillance only intimidated those with something to hide. And I had nothing left to hide. By evening, the HOA delivered a new envelope. This one was slid under my door rather than taped outside, as if the silence of delivery added weight to its message. Inside, a thick packet outlined a formal community safety review, scheduled specifically for my property. According to the letter, it was triggered by multiple reports of unsafe behavior and hostile environmental hazards linked to the recent incident involving the minor child of an HOA board member. The language was crafted to sound official, but buried beneath it was Marlene's unmistakable venom. The review allowed the HOA to enter my property, inspect anything they deemed suspicious, and photograph evidence for legal documentation. None of it aligned with actual HOA bylaws. But that didn't matter to people who believed they owned the rules. That night, the sky grew heavy with clouds, swallowing the moonlight until the neighborhood was drenched in darkness. The cameras glowed faintly in that void, blinking like mechanical fireflies. I stood by my window, watching them, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into my bones. Something had shifted fundamentally. This wasn't about a lawn anymore. It wasn't about Ethan's entitled behavior. It was about control, and the threat I posed to it by refusing to comply. Somewhere in that silent observation, I made another decision. If Marlene wanted a battle, she would get one. But it would not be fought through fear or aggression. It would be fought through truth, and through boundaries she could not twist into her narrative. The next morning, still cloaked in a haze of gray sky, I walked straight to the HOA office. The building, normally polished and smug in its presentation, felt different today, tense, defensive. The glass door reflected the storm clouds overhead as I pushed it open. Inside, Marlene sat behind her desk, as rigid as ever, though there was a sharpness to her posture that betrayed unease. She hadn't expected me to confront her directly, especially not when she believed she had the upper hand. I placed the packet from the night before on her desk without a word. The papers fanned out, exposing the bold titles and weaponized phrases. She looked at them, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet mine. The air between us felt electric, charged with all the conflict of the previous days. She opened her mouth, likely prepared to unleash another tirade of false authority, but I raised a hand, calm, controlled, firm. I told her I had reviewed the HOA bylaws thoroughly. Every rule, every clause, every amendment. I told her that not a single line allowed her to authorize trespassing, forced landscaping alterations, or mandatory surveillance without democratic approval from the community. I reminded her that any board member using HOA resources for personal vendettas could face legal consequences, not just removal from office but civil liability. With each word, her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but subtly, her eyes narrowing, her jaw stiffening, her fingers tapping the desk in slow, irritated beats. She wasn't used to being challenged with facts. She depended on fear, not structure. And for the first time, she realized I wasn't afraid. I told her the cameras violated privacy ordinances. I told her the notices violated due process. I told her the attempted forced entry by the landscaping crew constituted a breach of property right. I laid out every misstep she had made, every overreach she believed she could bury under official language. And then I said something that made her still completely. I'm done responding to threats. From now on, I respond to actions. Silence stretched across the office like a drawn curtain. Marlene's face hardened, but a hint of uncertainty flickered behind her controlled expression. She didn't speak. She didn't defend her choices. She simply glared, calculating her next move. That glare said everything. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't backing down. She was regrouping. When I walked out of that office, the storm clouds finally broke, sending sheets of rain across the neighborhood. The water soaked the lawn, darkening the soil, filling the shallow dip where Ethan had fallen. The rain felt cleansing, even as thunder cracked through the sky like a warning. But the real warning came later that evening. A new notice appeared on my door. Thicker, heavier, stamped with red lettering. It wasn't a violation. It was a summons. The HOA board had called an emergency disciplinary hearing. Not for Ethan, not for Marlene, but for me. And according to the final line, the outcome could include forced property modification or removal from the community. The war wasn't escalating. It was erupting. The summons felt heavier than paper should ever feel, a weight that settled deep in my chest long after I closed the door behind me. Its red lettering seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, an official warning wrapped in the arrogance of an HOA board convinced of its invincibility. As I set the notice on the kitchen table, rain pattered steadily against the windows, streaking down the glass like thin rivers. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing within this community, each crack of thunder echoing the tension that had spread across the neighborhood. I stared at the words, mandatory disciplinary hearing, knowing exactly what they meant. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. It was retribution, sharpened into procedure. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, in the HOA Community Hall. 3 days to prepare for a battle Marlene believed she had already won. She wanted spectacle. She wanted dominance. She wanted to make an example of me. Proof that anyone who challenged the presidency would face consequences until they bent or broke. But beneath her confidence was something she failed to consider. Pressure creates resolve. Threats create clarity. And power, when abused, eventually collapses under its own weight. The next morning, I stood outside, scanning the street. The rain had cleared, leaving the world washed clean yet tense. The cameras still pointed toward my home, their lenses fogged but unrelenting. The ground squished beneath my shoes, saturated from the storm. The shallow trap in my yard had filled with water, now a small pool reflecting the sky like a muted mirror. Even in its softened state, it remained the symbol of everything Marlene hated: resistance. I spent those days gathering evidence, not out of fear, but out of preparation. I documented every notice, every fabricated violation, every illegal action the HOA had attempted. I photographed the cameras, the angles, the placements. I recorded dates, times, and interactions. There was power in truth, especially when your opponent depended on distortion. As I compiled everything into a folder thick with unavoidable clarity, I realized something important. This wasn't just my battle anymore. It was a stand for every homeowner who had been silenced, intimidated, or bullied. My defense was becoming something much larger. As the day of the hearing approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew noticeably heavier. People walked with quicker steps, eyes darting away from mine. Conversations halted when I passed, not out of disdain, but out of fear of association. HOAs created environments where neutrality felt safest, and stepping outside that bubble could lead to scrutiny. Still, there were moments, small, nearly invisible, where neighbors offered subtle nods or sympathetic glances. Support whispered, never spoken. The morning of the hearing arrived with unsettling stillness. The air felt thicker, heavier. As I walked toward the community hall, the echo of my footsteps traveled strangely across the pavement. The building stood at the center of the neighborhood, its triangular roof and brick walls giving it the appearance of a courthouse rather than a meeting place. Large glass windows reflected the world with cold indifference. The closer I got, the more that structure felt like the heart of the power Marlene wielded. Inside, the hall buzzed with low murmurs. Rows of chairs had been arranged facing a long table draped in white cloth, where 5 board members sat in stiff formation. Marlene sat at the center, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. Ethan stood behind her, arms crossed, scowling as if the world owed him something. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and anxiety. People filled the chairs, neighbors who had avoided involvement now drawn in by the allure of conflict. HOA hearings always created an audience. When I entered, the room shifted. Heads turned, whispers tightened. But I walked steadily to the single chair placed before the board table, its positioning intentionally isolating. Marlene cleared her throat with exaggerated formality before announcing the hearing's purpose: to address my dangerous conduct, intentional creation of hazardous property features, and escalatory behavior detrimental to community harmony. Her words flowed smoothly, rehearsed, dripping with authority. Each allegation was presented with the confidence of someone certain the room belonged to her. When she finished, she folded her hands neatly, waiting for my response. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed the thick folder of evidence onto the table with deliberate calmness. The weight of it made a sharp sound against the wood, a sound that echoed across the hall. I began by addressing the first accusation, the supposed trap. I explained the dimensions, the purpose, the absence of intent to harm. I presented photos of Ethan tearing through my lawn, dates, times, and documented patterns of trespassing. The board members shifted uneasily. Next, I addressed the safety violations. I held up the fabricated notices, each one contradicting actual HOA bylaws, pages I highlighted and referenced directly. With every comparison, the claims dissolved. Marlene's composure faltered slightly, but she maintained her rigid posture. Then I addressed the cameras. When I displayed photos of their placements, angles, and lack of community approval, murmurs spread through the audience. People were uncomfortable with the realization that surveillance had been introduced without consent. I pointed out the violation of individual privacy rights and the overreach of authority. Some board members exchanged glances, unsure whether to side with Marlene or the incontrovertible evidence before them. Finally, I detailed the attempted forced entry by the landscaping crew, citing legal statutes defining trespassing and property right. The room shifted again. Several neighbors began whispering, their expressions taken aback. It became increasingly clear that the narrative Marlene worked tirelessly to construct was unraveling, thread by thread. The moment of fracture came when I calmly stated that any continuation of harassment would be met with legal action, not threatened but documented, filed, and pursued. The board members stiffened. HOA lawsuits were expensive, public, damaging. Marlene broke her silence then. She accused me of manipulating evidence, twisting facts, dramatizing events. But her voice quivered, not from emotion, but from losing control. She warned the board of dangerous precedents, of letting homeowners undermine authority. But her words were no longer sharpened commands. They were desperation disguised as logic. When she finished, the room fell into heavy silence. The board asked me to step outside while they deliberated. As I exited, neighbors parted quietly. Some avoided my gaze, but others offered faint, supportive nods, the kind of silent encouragement people give when they see someone stand against a force they themselves feared. I stood outside under the gray sky, listening to muffled voices through the door. Minutes stretched into something slow and suffocating. Finally, the door opened. The board had reached a decision. Their faces revealed nothing. But their verdict would change everything. When the board members filed back into the room, the shift in their expressions was impossible to ignore. Their faces, once mirrors of Marlene's rigid authority, now carried a subtle but unmistakable weight, uncertainty, responsibility, and something bordering on embarrassment. The tension inside the hall thickened until it felt like the air itself resisted movement. Neighbors leaned forward in their chairs, eyes flicking between me and the board with the collective anticipation of witnesses standing at the edge of a turning point. Marlene sat taller, as if trying to intimidate the verdict into aligning with her expectations. Ethan hovered behind her with crossed arms and a dark scowl, his entitlement still wrapped around him like armor. But neither of them could mask the flicker of doubt that betrayed their growing fear. The board's chairperson, a man who had always appeared uncomfortable with conflict, cleared his throat. His voice, usually meek, carried a strange sense of gravity as he began. He acknowledged that the HOA had reviewed all presented evidence, including documentation, photographs, and bylaws. His gaze briefly shifted toward Marlene, then returned to the paper in his hands. He stated that several actions taken against me, including fabricated notices, unauthorized surveillance, and attempts at forced landscaping, were inconsistent with HOA policy and procedure. The room reacted in a muted wave of whispers. Even the air changed, cooler, more alert, as if the community itself exhaled for the first time. Marlene's face stiffened, her knuckles whitening where she gripped the table's edge. The chairperson continued, explaining that while the HOA did not condone property alterations that may pose potential hazards, my intent had not been malicious or harmful. Instead, the board acknowledged that Ethan's repeated trespassing and property destruction were what triggered my actions. They further recognized that I had attempted to resolve the situation through proper channels but was dismissed without consideration. Every sentence the chair read dismantled the narrative Marlene had fought to construct. Then came the turning point. The board declared the disciplinary case against me closed. No fines, no penalties, no forced compliance orders. The hall erupted in a collective gasp, followed by scattered murmurs of disbelief. I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, but a release, a letting go of tension I'd carried since the day Ethan first tore across my lawn. But the decision did not end there. The chairperson hesitated before addressing the second portion of the board's findings, an investigation into the HOA president's actions. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. For years, Marlene had operated with absolute certainty that her authority was untouchable. But now, faced with the once unthinkable possibility of accountability, her composure cracked. Her chin lifted defensively, but her eyes narrowed, calculating outcomes she could no longer control. The board cited her unauthorized enforcement actions, misuse of HOA resources, installation of surveillance equipment without approval, and creation of inflated or falsified violations. Each accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples of shock across the hall. For a moment, even Ethan's posture faltered. The board concluded that Marlene's conduct represented a breach of fiduciary duty and an abuse of authority. Their final decision was delivered in measured, uneasy tones. She was to be removed temporarily from her leadership role pending a full community vote. The hall became a hive of voices, astonished, whispering, some even relieved. A few residents exchanged looks that hinted at long-suppressed frustrations suddenly finding air. Marlene didn't speak at first. She simply sat there, frozen, her expression collapsing inward like cracked porcelain. Her hands, once symbols of rigid control, trembled slightly as she reached for the papers in front of her. But her silence was short-lived. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her voice erupted, sharp and volatile, accusing the board of betrayal, accusing me of manipulation, accusing the entire room of weakness. Her words spiraled into a storm of outrage, each phrase dripping with venom. She demanded that Ethan follow her, insisted that the decision was illegitimate, and vowed to overturn it. But it was too late. The authority she had wielded so ruthlessly was slipping through her fingers. She stormed out of the hall, Ethan trailing behind her, though his defiance had faded into something quieter. Confusion, maybe even shame. As the door slammed shut, the echo lingered like the final crack of a collapsing structure. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached cautiously, not to celebrate but to acknowledge. A few offered small nods, tentative smiles, or murmured words about fairness and courage. Their kindness felt subdued but sincere, the kind of support that grows only after witnessing someone withstand a force many feared to face. Outside, the clouds had thinned, allowing late afternoon sunlight to spill across the pavement. The neighborhood felt different, still quiet, still wary, but less suffocating. The cameras were removed that same evening by an HOA technician. Each one came down with a metallic clink, leaving behind empty brackets and clear sightlines. For the first time in days, my home felt like my own again. That night, I stood on my lawn, the earth cool under my feet, the faint scent of freshly cut grass carried by the breeze. The shallow dip from the trap had refilled itself naturally, the soil settling back into place as though the land itself was healing. The memorial garden, though damaged, still held the promise of restoration. I knelt beside it, brushing away the last remnants of mud from the wooden edge. It was quiet, peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since moving into the community. And then, as dusk settled into the corners of the neighborhood, something unexpected happened. A neighbor I'd barely spoken to approached slowly, her expression shy but resolute. She thanked me, not for winning but for standing up. She explained that Marlene's intimidation had been a shadow over the community for years, but no one had dared to challenge her. My actions had shown them that they didn't have to accept it. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of something transformative. Because change doesn't always come from crowds. Sometimes it starts with one act of resistance, one boundary defended, one trap laid, not to harm but to reveal. As night settled, I stood and looked around my yard, the soft glow of porch lights reflecting against the quiet houses. The war was over. The storm had passed. But the story would linger as a reminder to every homeowner here. Power is only absolute when people allow it to be. And I had chosen not to allow it. For the first time since arriving, the neighborhood truly felt like home.